ES Audio.
From the Evening Standard in London, I'm John Weeks, and this is The Leader. As London's trains, tube services and buses continue to get people around the city, the future of Transport for London hangs in the balance. The firm's now received 4 short-term funding packages from the government to keep services running since it took a huge financial hit over the pandemic. Having passed the latest deadline in talks about that funding, TfL's updates this afternoon, the discussions with the Department for Transport are ongoing. The firm also insisted it needs over £920 million to get through the rest of the year, as well as a long-term funding deal. But it's not the only correspondence from TfL today. It's also accused unions of undermining its bailout deal negotiations, with further threats of strike action planned for later this month. So, what does the near future hold for TfL? And could we end up losing bus, train and tube services in the capital? Joining me now is the Evening Standard's political reporter, Rachael Burford. So Rachael, what do you make of TfL's latest update on the funding agreement?
Yeah, so the Transport Commissioner, Andy Burford, has sort of said we're still in negotiations, essentially, and we hope they'll be concluded successfully soon. This isn't too much of a surprise when we've been sort of talking to sources in both camps, the government and TfL. They've sort of said this is, a very complex agreement they're going through. They're going through it clause by clause, and it was likely that there may have to be a little bit of an extension to talks. The original deadline that the government gave was lunchtime today, but it looks like they are going to need a little bit of extension while they still sort of thrash out each clause of this bailout.
And what about this letter from TfL to the RMT union warning about the consequences of strike action? How has the RMT responded?
So in response to the letter, Mick Lynch has said RMT members have only asked for assurances about their jobs, pensions and working conditions, and the letter does not address that at all. The RMT acknowledges that TfL has been asked to make £2 billion worth of cuts, but that the Mayor Sadiq Khan should focus his attention on the government and not take it out on tube workers. Mick Lynch says, we're prepared to work with TfL, but our members will not be sacrificial lambs on the altar of austerity.
And there's obviously huge pressure on TfL to become financially sustainable by April 2023, as laid out by the government as a condition of this funding. Is it inevitable this will lead to cuts to services as well as price rises?
Well, yes. I mean, TfL's position on this is, they're already consulting on sort of 18% cut to bus services in the capital. They have sort of talked about there may have to be cuts to tube lines, etc. And, it's capital programmes, which includes things like, replacing all the dilapidated Bakerloo line trains. They're going to be put under threat if they don't get the money that they need. And their argument has always been, they are a major transport network in one of the biggest cities in the world. They should be getting money from central government, as many other cities do. So that is their position. Passenger numbers are still about 20% lower than they were pre-pandemic, so they're not getting that revenue in. And they've always slightly struggled to keep their heads above water in terms of funding. I think Andy Burford has said they will need £927 million just to see out the financial year. And that is what a lot of the negotiation today with government is about.
And Sadiq Khan has warned before that entire tube lines and up to 100 bus routes may need to be cut to keep TfL running. Is that still a possibility?
Yeah, that is what Sadiq Khan has warned. And City Hall has said they are consulting on cuts to services, cuts to bus services, cuts to tube services. But, TfL is always used a little bit of a political football between the Conservative government and the Labour-run City Hall. But it is in neither side's interest to see huge cuts to our transport service in the capital, especially at a time when London's economy is still recovering from the pandemic. They do want to see people getting back to work, getting back to offices, to see central London thriving again. So, both sides are threatening things at the moment, but in the end, they are sort of really thrashing out a deal that will hopefully be in the best interests of Londoners.
Let's take a break now. In part 2, Nick Bowes, CEO of think tank Centre for London, explains why TfL will struggle to become financially sustainable.
So if you can't bring in any more money and the government's not prepared to give you any more money, TfL can't borrow any more money because there's a limit on what it can borrow, you've got to cut your expenditure.
Nick Bowes, CEO of Centre for London, joins me now. So Nick, how would you summarise the situation facing TfL right now?
It feels like we're trapped in some kind of never-ending story with extended funding deals, temporary bailout periods of a couple of weeks, discussions going to the wire, but it doesn't really feel like we're making much progress. There does seem to still be quite a large gap between both sides, and I think it's going to be some time yet until there's an agreement. The problem with that is that it does create an enormous amount of uncertainty. Londoners will be worried about what will happen to their buses, tubes and trains. Will they stop running at some point, or will services deteriorate? For TfL itself, it's a huge organisation. It's got a global reputation as a public transport authority. It's already suffering from good people leaving because they're in no position to do any forward planning. They can't plan for the long term, which is absolutely critical when you're running a £12 billion public transport network with Victorian infrastructure. You've got to be constantly upgrading, maintaining your assets and planning ahead. They can't, at the moment, see beyond the end of the week because their funding situation is so uncertain and so much effort and time has been sucked into these negotiations. It's just distracting from many of the day-to-day things that you need to do when you're running a public transport network in a city like London.
So what sort of factors have contributed to TfL being in such a tight financial situation?
Very few, if any, similar public transport authorities for cities like London rely solely on fares income to maintain themselves. Nearly all of them have got some form of public subsidy in one form or another. Some of that comes from national government. Sometimes the regional or city government has got the power to levy and collect taxes itself. Now, London's in a position where it's got very limited powers to levy and raise taxes itself, and therefore historically it's tended to rely on support from government, both for revenue running costs, but also for capital investment. The revenue support disappeared before the pandemic. It went from about £1 billion a year down to zero. And TfL was pretty close to being self-sufficient, actually, till the pandemic came along. But it is, as you said, it left it very exposed because it was at nearly 70%, maybe a little bit more reliant on fares income. It didn't have a broad base of funding sources. So as soon as passenger numbers collapsed as they did during the pandemic, it was obviously suddenly short of vast amounts of revenue.
And we know the company's been given the challenge of becoming financially sustainable by April. So much of its revenue comes from tickets. How else does or can it make money?
So if they are to be self-sufficient, there's a limit, actually, to how they can do that. They either do that by finding alternative funding sources. They could put up fares massively. Obviously, that actually can have a negative effect because it means fewer people travel. They could try and generate more income from their commercial side through the concessions and the shops that they have on their estate, through the development of new housing on their land. And that will play a role, but it won't be enough to fill this gap. Or they try and raise money through other sources. Now, the mayor has got one key power, and that is he's got road user charging powers. He uses them for congestion charge, for ultra-low emission zone, but some kind of smart pay-per-mile road user charging scheme, something Centre for London's been calling for some time, could generate an enormous amount of money. It'll be controversial, there'll be a lot of people who won't like it, but it will help deliver on a number of objectives, tackling congestion, improving air quality, promoting active travel, but as I said, could generate a lot of income. But you can't just flick the switch on that overnight. It's going to take a long time to bring in. No one's ever done it on this scale. Got to go through lots of legal hoops. So you're talking 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 years before it starts bringing in any money. So if you can't bring in any more money and the government's not prepared to give you any more money, TfL can't borrow any more money because there's a limit on what it can borrow. You've got to cut your expenditure. And that's this point that the mayor's made, that there'll be the managed decline. We'll see a reduction in services. There'll be cuts to maintenance and investment. We'll see a deterioration of the network. There'll be no new schemes. We'll struggle to keep hold of the ones we've got, and there'll just be a steady deterioration and decline.
So, Nick, what is your prediction for what will happen with TfL in the next few months?
So, I'm not a betting man, but on the basis of where we've been these last couple of years, I still think we're just going to have a number of short-term funding deals over the next couple of months, maybe years. There's two factors at play, political factors. One, obviously, in early September, there's going to be a new Prime Minister. There'll be new faces at number 10. There'll potentially be a new Transport Secretary, maybe a new Chancellor. I mean, that does change things potentially. There may be opportunities there to actually just think afresh and step back, because I think, relationships between the current people in government and City Hall TfL are obviously pretty soured. So that could be a chink of light. But I think the other thing that's kind of hanging over this is that it's now less than 2 years till the next mayoral election. There's going to be a Conservative government for all of that period. Politically, I can't see why the government would want to do vast favours for a Labour mayor or a Labour city, actually, given that the political focus is still not in London. It's still in those red wall and those northern seats. So I think we'll probably see some shrinking of TfL. I think you'll probably see the mayor push ahead with some kind of road user charging scheme. And I think you'll probably see the government will have to put some capital money in to help with potentially building some new schemes or just maintaining the system as is, because otherwise there's a real risk it deteriorates. And there's people in government who know that London and its success is critical to the country. And if you undermine that by the transport system not working properly, you do risk that money drying up. And London and the South East are the only two bits of the country that contribute more in than they take back. And at a time when public finances are not in a fantastic shape, that'd be a big gamble.
There's more news in the Evening Standard newspaper and online at standard.co.uk. That's The Leader. Thanks for listening. We're back tomorrow at 4 p.m.